bad things well said.
Happy New Year. Well, except if you happen to own a car in Iceland, it's not really a Happy New Year, is it?
Not in the financial sense, no, because as the champagne bubbles go flat and that brief, terrifying excitement of another volcanic fissure nearby starts to fade,
Right.
The first thing you're going to realize on January 1st, 2026 is that your car's odometer. It's not just counting miles anymore, it's a state informant.
A state informant. That's a good way to put it.
It's the most profound shift in the relationship between citizen and state since we stopped paying taxes and salted cod.
Yeah.
We used to wish people health and prosperity.
Boy, now.
Now, the government is just replacing those old well wishes with structural, metered financial dread. Privacy, my friend, died on the ring road at exactly midnight. Your brother isn't just watching anymore.
No.
He's sending the bill. For every single 6.95 ISK increment of movement you attempt.
Welcome to this special edition of Bad Things Well Said Icelandic Newsroom. You might have heard our exploration of fuel prices earlier this week, and if you haven't, you absolutely should. But today, we're giving you another special. It's the first day of the new year.
And we are abandoning all the usual celebratory nonsense. We are not summarizing 2025. That's for other people. We are performing an archaeology of the future for year 2026.
It's an autopsy, really.
Yeah.
A forensic analysis of what feels like structural inevitability.
Yeah.
We're examining the economic, the political, the social dynamics.
And our mission, as always, is to give you that necessary, if, let's be honest, deeply unpleasant clarity. So that by, say, June or July, we can all proudly shout, "I freaking told you so!"
Look, the volcano isn't the real existential disaster here. The new tax code is.
Yeah.
I mean, while magma is pooling beneath Svartsengi in this geological slow burn, a phenomenon that the nation has, in a truly Kafkaesque way, somehow normalized and even monetized. A far more destructive bureaucratic lava flow has just erupted in Helsinki, the Kilometre tax.
And it's burning the suburban dream of, say, a place like Selfoss right to the ground. The family car, that symbol of freedom. It's been converted
Into what?
into a mobile debt instrument that tracks your every move. It's necessary, it's precise, and it is utterly, utterly devoid of a soul. It's poetry, I suppose, if you like the cold, hard efficiency of actuarial tables and financial repression.
So if you're listening, you should know. This isn't going to be relaxing. It's not pleasant.
But it will be ruthlessly necessary.
A warning, then. Don't subscribe. It might make you think. Okay, so let's unpack this. Act I, the recursion. We really need to establish the historical and economic fatality of Iceland's situation in 2026.
Yes, because the greatest, most pervasive lie we tell ourselves, globally, but especially here in the highly educated, self-congratulatory bubble of Reykjavik, is the "this time is different" lie.
The four most expensive words in the English language.
Exactly. That phrase, it should be stamped on the forehead of every finance minister on the planet. It is the intellectual virus of the ruling class. The historical work of Reinhardt and Rogoff proves it again and again and again. Every financial elite convinces itself that their modern, sophisticated regulatory tools
Right.
have somehow immunized them against the immutable laws of economic gravity.
We're doing it right now here in Iceland. We tell ourselves the eruption crisis has settled down, the economy is stabilizing, our technocrats have it all under control.
It's pure hubris, the kind of hubris that has toppled sovereigns since Edward III defaulted on his Italian bankers back in 1340 and set off a chain reaction across Europe. We are not immune. We are just reenacting a very old, very boring play.
With slightly better special effects.
With slightly better special effects, exactly. So 2026 isn't a fresh start, not in the way the government wants you to believe. It's the accumulated marginalia of 8 centuries of financial self-delusion. We've simply entered what we call the great threshold of enforced maturity.
Enforced maturity, explain that.
The adrenaline of the crisis, all that incredible liquidity pumped in post-pandemic, the massive state intervention to manage the volcanic eruptions from 23 through 25, all of that fades. And what's left is the dull, persistent ache of repayment.
You've used the phrase serial default before. That sounds heavy. What mechanism specifically allows the state to default without, actually announcing it? Because we're not seeing mass national bankruptcy, are we?
No, not overtly. That's the genius of the modern financial state. Iceland, having emerged from this post-pandemic inflation shock, is now just reenacting the universal rite of passage for all emerging markets.
Such as?
First, you get the boom, funded by cheap money. Second, the bust, triggered by some external shock or inflation. And third, the inevitable protracted punishment of the middle class to protect the sovereign's credit rating. The default occurs through inflation and what's called financial repression, not through a big headline.
So when the government is out there touting stability, we should be deeply skeptical of the statistics they're presenting.
Deeply. The official optimistic forecast from the Central Statistical Office, Hagræðing, is that inflation will stabilize to, 3.5%? It's a number that's just hovering above their target. It sounds manageable, right? It sounds like we won the fight.
It does. It sounds exactly like the soft landing they promised us for months.
It's fiction. It is fiction dressed up as comforting statistics. Because if you read the fine print in the private banking forecasts, the consensus is that inflation is going to remain much stickier, closer to 4%.
Okay.
And when you couple that statistical fantasy with the anemic GDP growth forecast of only 1.8% for 2026, a number that's barely keeping pace with population growth, what you really have is stagnation dressed up as stability.
The fever's broken,
right,
but the patient is in a coma.
Or suffering from hypothermia, unable to move. They want you to feel relieved, even as you realize you can't feel your toes.
That connects directly to this other critical hidden element you mentioned, the domestic debt illusion. The Ministry of Finance seems to genuinely believe that borrowing in krona from our own Icelandic pension funds is somehow safer than borrowing in dollars from Wall Street.
It's a profound self-deception, a total trap. The historical autopsy of debt cycles confirms this reliance on domestic debt is just. It's a poison pill. The narrative is, we owe the money to ourselves, so it's fine. But this creates what we call a hidden burden.
How so?
The state's massive obligations, the bonds it issues, are purchased by our national pension funds. This means the states need to fund roads and hospitals and, massive geological bailouts. It competes directly with the long-term solvency of your retirement savings.
That's the classic crowding out effect, isn't it?
Precisely. The state is competing with private enterprise for the very limited pool of available domestic savings, all that pension fund capital. By issuing these large, high-interest bonds to finance its operations, the state pushes up the cost of capital for everyone else. It strangles the small and medium businesses that are just trying to invest or grow or hire someone.
And we have a magnificent, almost existential example of this hidden burden manifesting in 2026. The socialization of geological risk via Thorkatla.
The Grindavik buyout. It is the most spectacular example of contingent liability I think I've ever seen.
Define that for us, contingent liability.
It's just a potential debt that might occur depending on the outcome of some uncertain future event, in this case, more lava flows. The state is assuming a massive, unpredictable liability by buying out the entire town's property. This is an absolutely essential humanitarian gesture, don't get me wrong, but economically, it is the issuing of a massive urgent domestic bond. The state is absorbing private geological losses directly onto the public balance sheet.
The cost is staggering. We're talking hundreds of billions of kroner being absorbed. So the interest on that new massive domestic bond, the coupon payment, you argue that's paid in the degradation of public services.
Because where else is the money going to come from? It has to be diverted from somewhere. The queues at Landspitali, the National Hospital, they are not purely a symptom of poor management. They are the literal, visceral coupon payments on the Grindavik bailout bond.
Wow.
The money had to come from somewhere. And because this Valkyrie government won't touch the bureaucracy, won't challenge the bank margins, and refuses to cut subsidies for the entrenched oligopoly, they cut the service level that you, the middle class, depend on. Public service degradation is the price of stabilizing the Reykjanes Peninsula.
This definitely smells like financial repression. Which brings us to their most potent weapon, the central bank's stranglehold.
We've been watching this play out for months. The official policy interest rate is a crippling 7.25% as we enter 2026. And this isn't just an effort to cool consumer spending, which is the official line.
It's not.
No, it serves a dual purpose. First, it defends the krona against external shocks by making Icelandic assets look attractive to foreign capital. But second, and more importantly for us, it is a deliberate, targeted effort to suffocate housing and construction investment.
To maintain technical solvency while morally bankrupting the middle class. You've said that before. What does that actually mean for, say, the construction sector?
That 7.25% rate is hypothermia for construction. Banks can't responsibly lend for new projects at that rate without massive risk, and developers can't afford to borrow. So what happens? Housing supply stagnates, the cost of housing remains structurally insanely high, and young families are forced into the rental market, or worse, out of the country.
So they're trading one pain for another.
Exactly. They're trading the pain of inflation for the pain of high interest, ensuring that the burden falls squarely on those trying to build a future for themselves.
And even if inflation eventually bends to this pressure, we are left with what you call the true root of all evil: price indexation. This is the mechanism that ensures even a statistical recovery feels like a financial defeat.
Let's define verträging really clearly for the listener. In theory, it protects lenders from inflation by linking the principal amount of the loan, the amount you borrowed, to the consumer price index, the CPI.
But in reality,
it is a sophisticated mechanism designed to redistribute wealth upward to the lenders, ensuring they are always compensated for past financial mismanagement by the state.
this is the second inflation trap you talk about. How does that work mathematically?
Okay, so the central bank might, theoretically, hit its 3.5% inflation target by late 2026. But because verträging links your debt repayment to the accumulated past inflation, all those high CPI readings from 2024 and 2025, your actual monthly mortgage payment is still climbing, relentlessly.
So you feel poorer even when the statistics say you're recovering.
Exactly. You might feel a little bit of relief that prices aren't rising as fast this month, but your total debt burden, your monthly payment, is still being fueled by the economic damage inflicted months ago. It's like running up a down escalator. You're just losing ground.
So we're not just dealing with domestic structural issues then. We are, as you say, a small boat, the krona, on a violent global ocean. How does Iceland's small currency, high sensitivity pattern play out in 2026?
Our fate is decided not in Helsinki, but in the boardrooms of the European Central Bank in Frankfurt and the Federal Reserve in Washington. It's that simple. And we're watching two distinct global trends converge on us. We're seeing the end of cheap global liquidity.
Which means
that soft landing, promised by our central bank, is fiction. It's a fantasy. Because the runway, the flow of global capital, is constantly moving and shrinking.
And then there's the paradox of the krona itself. The projected exchange rate for 2026 is somewhere around 147 Eurisk. That sounds good for national pride, a strong currency.
It sounds excellent for the financial sector and for importing expensive French cheeses. But what's fascinating is that a stronger krona paradoxically erodes the competitiveness of our key export sectors: fisheries, aluminum, and crucially, tourism.
Our products and services just instantly become more expensive for the global buyer.
Instantly. It's the periphery's dilemma. You either get hammered by high inflation and a weak currency that makes imports impossible, or you get hammered by economic stagnation and a strong currency that makes exports prohibitive. Either way.
The productive middle class pays the price.
Every single time.
And this feeds directly into the second global trend you mentioned, the commodification of climate.
Yeah.
The local wind farm conflicts we see in the news all the time, the fights over permits, land use. That's not just a local zoning dispute, is it?
Not at all. It is the local manifestation of a global ravenous hunger for green electrons. It's driven by massive environmental, social, and governance ESG mandates from foreign capital. Major European pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, big international banks. They are all demanding proof of green investment. And Iceland, with its vast geothermal and hydro potential, is seen as a giant battery pack just waiting to be tapped.
So we're being forced to industrialize our wilderness, to pave over the lava fields, essentially, just to satisfy the balance sheets of foreign capital seeking to tick their ESG compliance boxes.
That is precisely the price of being a periphery market in the age of climate capitalism. You trade your pristine image, the very thing that draws the tourists in the first place, for industrial energy output. It erodes the core tourism narrative while simultaneously satisfying foreign balance sheets. We are sacrificing our landscape for someone else's compliance certificate.
And speaking of core structural elements being sacrificed, we have to talk about the demographic engine. The data is clear. 18.9% of our population are first-generation immigrants. They're propping up the pension system. They're providing the necessary labor in essential sectors, healthcare, tourism, construction. And yet,
And yet, they are the primary, most consistent target of political scapegoating. It is the ultimate cynical paradox of the 2026 political landscape. The system literally relies on the sustained import of labor just to maintain solvency in the pension system and keep critical services running, especially given the aging Icelandic population.
If that 18.9% just stopped showing up for work tomorrow,
The system would immediately buckle, it would collapse.
but the political narrative is entirely different.
The political narrative is all about cheap electoral victory. By blaming the immigrant population for housing shortages or cultural issues, politicians achieve populist traction while completely sidestepping the actual structural failures. The 7.25% interest rate, the delayed housing construction, the institutional anorexia of public services. They are simultaneously the structural foundation and the political whipping boy. It is intellectually dishonest, structurally fatalistic, and deeply corrosive.
Okay, let's move to Act 2, the friction. We're calling this one the heist and the absurd. If Act was about the slow, structural inevitability that crushes you,
Act 2 is about the immediate, tangible pain that starts right now. The pain that hits your wallet every single time you start your car's engine. And the villain, as we established, is the odometer. We are talking about the Great Kilometre Equalization, the Kilometre gold.
It is a beautifully constructed bureaucratic trap. It was designed by someone who studied human psychology as much as they studied tax law.
How so?
They know you need a dopamine hit to accept surveillance. So, what is step 1 of the heist? They abolish the fuel excise tax.
The estimated immediate drop in the price per liter of fuel at the pump is what, around 80 ISK? For about 72 hours, everyone is thinking the government finally listened, we saved money. It's a momentary, glorious illusion of relief.
That is the bait. Because in exchange, the net is cast wide, and the true cost is revealed in step 2, the great equalization. Every single passenger vehicle under 3,500 kilograms, petrol, diesel, hybrid, EV, doesn't matter, is now billed directly for its movement. The unified tax rate is 6.95 ISK per kilometer.
And this, fundamentally, is the end of pay-as-you-pump anonymity. Before January 1st, a driver with a combustion engine could pay in cash, drive as much as they wanted, and remain a financial ghost to the state's revenue service.
Not anymore. Now the state converts the entire national fleet into a subscription service, tracked and billed via your registration.
And this surveillance is enforced. Step 3, the penalty.
Oh yes, you have to register your odometer reading on the government website, island.is. And the hard deadline is brutally close. January 20, 2026. Miss that deadline or willfully underreport, and you get the administrative penalty for forgetfulness or for resistance.
Which is?
A chilling 20,000 ISK fine. It's a digital panopticon going live, and the first lesson they teach is submission via penalty.
It's the most comprehensive data collection exercise the nation has ever undertaken. Let's break down the winners and losers in this zero-sum game. The winners are clear, right?
Oh, absolutely. The state treasury, which now has stable, predictable revenue regardless of global oil price volatility. And, of course, the bureaucracy, which gains total centralized data on the movement patterns of the entire national fleet later that will be monetized, cross-referenced, and used in ways we haven't even conceived of yet.
And the losers.
They are numerous and specifically targeted. First, the diesel driver. They traded slightly cheaper fuel for guaranteed non-negotiable surveillance and a stable tax bill they absolutely cannot avoid. They used to drive the most efficient internal combustion engine, but now they pay the same 6.95 ISK per kilometer as the most polluting old petrol car.
But the truly brilliant, cynical winner in all this is the hidden revenue stream. The tourist.
Ah, yes, the ring road tax. It's tourism taxation by stealth. I mean, think about the mechanics. A tourist rents a car. They drive the entire ring road, that's about 1,332 kilometers, plus all the deviations for sites, airport runs, maybe a trip up to Hagræðing.
You could easily hit 2,000 kilometers over a 2-week trip.
Easily. And at 6.95 ISK per kilometer.
That tax bill alone is going to be about, what, 13,900 ISK added invisibly to the rental cost?
Exactly. The tourist doesn't notice the 80 ISK drop in fuel, but they absolutely pay that hidden tax. And the rental company does all the compliance work for the state. It's clever, but it paradoxically hurts the tourism sector that is already struggling to compete because of that strong krona.
Let's revisit that krona strength because it's so critical. We noted the projected rate of 147 euros in 2026. A strong currency is usually a sign of a strong economy, but you argue it's actually a symptom of stagnation.
It is. The currency is being defended by that cripplingly high interest rate, the 7.25%. The krona is artificially strong because foreign capital is attracted by that high yield, but that strength is crushing domestic industry.
So when the krona gets strong,
Our fish exports cost more in London, our aluminum costs more in Amsterdam, and that beautiful, expensive tourist package costs far more than the equivalent trip to Norway or Switzerland. It's the central bank maintaining technical solvency by kneecapping the export engine.
which brings us to the glorious, ridiculous, absurdist war of 2026. The collision between bureaucratic logic and organic reality. Let's start with the existential threat to our infrastructure. The pink-footed geese.
I still can't quite believe this is a real problem. We have billions of kroner in desperately needed, globally mandated energy investment tied up in the implementation of the new energy framework, Rama Atlan. The state needs these wind farms online to satisfy those ESG mandates we talked about.
But what is holding up these massive projects?
Ornithological bureaucracy.
You're kidding?
I wish I were. Specifically, the requirement for radar studies of pink-footed geese migration. We have national economic progress being held hostage by the flight path of a waterfowl, the environmental protection of which requires years of dedicated study.
It's Kafka meets Werner Herzog.
It is. The government must industrialize its wilderness, but the environmental bureaucracy, in its infinite wisdom, must follow protocol perfectly. So you have years of observing geese to prevent ecological damage. It's the ultimate collision between the desperate pursuit of foreign capital via green electrons and the sanctity of the bird flight path. The regulatory friction is now so high that it's causing national paralysis.
And this regulatory gridlock, this inability to secure future reliable revenue from energy projects, it forces the government to resort to desperate measures for immediate cash flow. Which brings us to institutional anorexia.
Hagræðing. Let's define the term formally first. In government newspeak, Hagræðing or rationalization means increasing efficiency in the public sector, streamlining operations, improving value for money.
And your translation.
Our translation, institutional anorexia. And we see the hypocrisy immediately. We have a socialist-led government that is actively selling off state assets like valuable real estate in Kornbrekka just to plug short-term budget holes created by structural debt and frozen revenue streams.
It's austerity with a red tie. They campaign on social welfare and preventing privatization, and then they're caught stripping the copper wiring out of the State House to pay the electric bill. All because they can't get the wind turbines built fast enough to please the ESG gods.
It just proves that when the structural debt and the contingent liabilities get large enough, ideology completely dissolves. Only cold, transactional necessity remains. You will sell whatever you need to sell to keep the lights on and keep that credit rating high.
And the crowning jewel of infrastructural absurdity, the thing that crystallizes the pain of this new tax. Borgarlín and Ann, the city line.
The waiting for Godot of Icelandic infrastructure. It is the transit system that is perpetually promised as the ultimate solution to the pain of the Kilometre jolt.
Right. The government's implicit contract is, pay your mileage tithe, and we promise one day you won't have to use your car. We'll build you a world-class transit system.
But the risk of delay is existential. You are taxing the roads we currently use. You are charging us 6.95 ISK per kilometer, which is essentially discouraging the commute. Yet the promised alternative is non-existent or perpetually delayed.
That is the ultimate absurdity of the Absurdist War.
It is. We are paying the tax for roads we are discouraged from using to fund a massive delayed bus system. The absurdity isn't that the project exists. The absurdity is that the government is already taxing us for the anticipated comfort of a solution that hasn't materialized yet. They are funding the paralysis of the present with the hope of the future. It's genius, truly, taxing the very hope of future public transport.
Now we have to address the political friction itself. We've named them the Government of Valkyries. Prime Minister Kristrún Frostadóttir of Samfylkingin, Hordur Katrín Gunnarsdóttir of Viðreis, and Inga Sæland from Flokkur Fólksins. This coalition is built on a tectonic fault line, and 2026 is when the plates are going to shift.
It's less a governing coalition and more a hostage situation, where the ransom is the state budget. You have Viðreis on one side demanding market efficiency and cuts radical Hagræðing to balance the books, and then you have Flokkur Fólksins diametrically opposed, fighting those cuts and what they see as rising hidden poverty caused by the indexed mortgages and high interest rates.
And those two forces cannot coexist in an economy growing at a mere 1.8% GDP. In a boom, you can paper over ideological differences.
But in stagnation, every single budget decision is a zero-sum game, and that makes the government fundamentally paralyzed. They're engaging only in political defense. They spend all their time managing internal friction, arguing over whether to fund a new hospital wing or sell off an asset, rather than actually solving national problems like housing or infrastructure delays.
The volatility is palpable.
Oh, absolutely. Any strong push, say, from a major unexpected union demand during the Samningar wage negotiations could shatter the fragile peace.
Which is why we need to end Act 2 with the final, most crucial element, the liar's dictionary. To survive 2026 without losing your mind, you have to be able to translate the government's newspeak into the brutal truth.
Let's start with the term we hear constantly, usually delivered with a soft, reassuring voice: soft landing.
Official definition: a gradual cooling of the economy designed to bring inflation back down to target without causing a recession. Our translation:
calculated suffocation.
Elaborate on that. Calculated suffocation.
It is the intentional strategy where the middle class loses a little bit of their solvency every single month via high interest, indexation, new taxes intentionally, so that the system doesn't break all at once with a headline recession. It creates what global economists call the zombie economy. Households and businesses that aren't technically bankrupt, but they aren't truly living or investing either. They're just servicing debt until they expire. This is preferred to the chaos of a hard crash.
Next up, Hagræðing, rationalization. We touched on this with the Cornbrecker fire sale.
Official definition: increasing efficiency in the public sector, streamlining operations, ensuring better outcomes per krona spent.
Our translation: institutional anorexia.
This is critical. It's the polite term for starving hospitals, schools, and essential public services of staff and resources until the queues become so long that patients and users just give up or are forced to go private. They don't cut the budget line item itself. They just ensure the quality of the service degrades until nobody wants to use it anymore. It is austerity wearing a human resources mask. It's designed to mask the coupon payments on the Sorkatla bond.
The annual ritual of Samningar, the wage agreements.
Official definition: collective bargaining between unions and employers to secure fair and sustainable wages for the working population.
Our translation: the inflationary hamster wheel.
It is a profound, frustrating ritual where the unions secure, say, a 5.5% raise to fight cost of living increases. Meanwhile, the state, through new taxes like the Kilometre and the lingering effects of indexation, immediately imposes 6% effective inflation.
So you get a raise.
You feel a momentary victory on payday, but 2 months later, the cumulative price of everything, including your indexed mortgage payment, has completely swallowed the entire raise. You run faster just to stay in the same tax bracket, or, more accurately, to fall further behind, just slower.
Fiscal prudence, the phrase used by every finance minister ever.
Official definition: prudent management of the state's finances, ensuring long-term debt sustainability and currency stability.
Our translation: protection of the oligopoly.
Rigorous defense. Look, stability in this political lexicon does not mean household peace of mind or economic growth. It means the powerful, entrenched banks stay profitable and solvent. It means their margins are protected at all costs, even at the expense of household purchasing power.
So the 7.25% interest rate.
It's fiscally prudent for the balance sheet of the lenders. It is an existential threat to the borrower. You stay anxious, they stay rich. That is fiscal prudence in Iceland 2026.
And finally, the ultimate rebranding exercise used to justify the new tax: energy transition.
Official definition: shifting the national energy infrastructure to sustainable, non-fossil fuel sources to meet climate goals.
Our translation: the mileage tithe.
Because it is the high-minded justification to tax the mere act of movement, regardless of engine type, it converts using the road into a transactional, monetized service, forcing you to pay 6.95 ISK for every single kilometer you travel. The green label is simply the camouflage for the new, guaranteed revenue stream the state treasury desperately needs to cover the costs of the Grindavik bailout and all that delayed infrastructure. The state has weaponized climate concern to monetize your car. Now we have to move to Act 3, the light. Because if we stopped right there, you'd be fully prepared to sell your car for scrap metal and move to Spain. We need to find the genuine, if deeply cynical, sources of hope and grit.
And that hope certainly does not emanate from the parliamentary buildings of Helsinki. It radiates instead from the scattered residents of Grindavik. This is the earned hope, the resilience of the geological nomads.
January 1st, 2026 marks the final deadline for the state buyout via Horkatla. The town, as a functioning residential area, is. It's functionally deleted. It's transitioning into an industrial and utility zone. The state literally moved to town, bought it out, locked the zip code, and absorbed the geological risk to protect people from nature. The physical location has been liquidated.
But the community grit, the social infrastructure, that survives. They're scattered across the greater capital region and beyond, yet their identity persists. They're the vanguard of a new Icelandic identity, the geological nomad.
The lesson there is profound. They prove that you can move the physical boundaries, you can nationalize the homes, you can melt the asphalt, but you cannot liquidate the community spirit. That is insolent, pure strength. They have been through the absolute worst and they adapted. That is the true Icelandic spirit forged in lava.
And that insolent strength is best exemplified by the living defiance of the Selfoss commuter.
Let's put a concrete human face on the cost of the Kilometre and the broader financial repression. Imagine this person in Selfoss. They have a regular daily commute of 110 kilometers round trip to the capital region.
Okay.
Over the course of a 220-day working year, that's 24,200 kilometers.
At the unified rate of 6.95 ISK per kilometer, that translates to an annual unavoidable tax bill of approximately, 180,000 ISK? Just to get to work and back.
Just to get to work. And this is on top of that indexed mortgage that keeps climbing because of vertrigging. They face financial pressure from the 7.25% interest rate, the new mileage tithe, and general institutional anorexia in public services. The government's spreadsheet logic dictates that this person should collapse, they should move closer to Reykjavik, or just stop driving.
And yet, they drive. They carpool, they adapt, they buy older, reliable vehicles, they figure out the system. They are the living defiance of the government's spreadsheet logic.
They are the actual economy, the resilient engine that keeps the country functioning despite every single bureaucratic effort to slow them down. It's the sheer refusal to surrender to bureaucratic fatalism. They look at the absurdity of the pink-footed goose radar studies, the delayed Borgarlínan, and the climbing debt, and they just shrug and adapt. That is the true cynical grit, not the mythical nonsense you read about in tourist brochures.
So we end with a cynical weather forecast for the political year ahead. What are we looking at atmospherically over the halls of power?
The condition. A stationary low-pressure system stalled directly over Helsinki. Heavy fog obscuring any long-term vision, making meaningful, non-transactional decision-making basically impossible. The atmosphere is tense and humid with political rivalry.
And the warnings? Any warnings?
A high probability of slush. That is, dirty, short-term compromises mixed with politically frozen wages and continued indexation increases. The cooling economy will feel like hypothermia for the construction sector, already kneecapped by that 7.25% interest rate. And we expect sporadic squalls of aggressive populist outrage from the opposition, trying to take advantage of the paralysis within the Valkyrie government. Expect high political drama with zero policy outcome.
Let's offer a final benediction then for the Icelandic soul as we enter this grave new metered year. We offer 3 paradoxical wishes.
First, the retirement of Theta Redis.
The national mantra of denial. It will work out. We wish you the courage to stop believing that and to start seeing exactly how the system is working you over. A little less denial, maybe a little more revolutionary sobriety.
Second, untaxed light. May the geothermal warmth always remind you that this land fundamentally gives everything essential for free, until, of course, someone figures out how to install a meter on the outflow and bill you 6.95 ISK per degree of heat transfer.
And finally, the Grindavik grit. We wish you that raw, insolent Icelandic strength that looks at the abyss, looks at the crushing 7.25% interest rate, looks at the new tax and says, you can take our zip code, you can tax our movement, but you cannot liquidate our community.
That is the only true hedge against the structural inevitability we've discussed today. The individual refusal to be a mere data point on a spreadsheet.
In the end, 2026 in Iceland is a monument to the eternal recurrence of history. The Valkyrie government believes it can engineer a new technocratic reality where debts don't matter, where geese can hold up billions in infrastructure, and where the middle class just pays for the system's solvency.
But the ghosts of Edward III's defaulted bankers, the ghosts of the 1873 financial crash, and the ghosts of 2008 are watching. The transition to domestic debt hasn't made the country fundamentally safer. It has just moved the gun from the temple to the mouth of the pension funds.
The kilometer tax hasn't solved the revenue problem. It has just successfully monetized the fundamental act of leaving your house for everyone, regardless of how green you drive.
The lesson of 2026 is simple. You can print money, you can index loans, and you can tax kilometers. But you cannot legislate away the volcano, and you absolutely cannot tax your way out of the brutal truth that eventually someone has to pay the bill.
Thank you for joining us for this forensic autopsy of the year ahead. We hope it makes your new year a little more cynical and therefore a little more truthful.
Don't tell anyone you listened. We prefer to operate in the shadows of uncomfortable truth.
And now for the required words. The voices in this podcast were generated by AI. However, all information, facts, claims, concepts, and the script itself were prepared, editorially reviewed, and are the original work of a human author.
Bad things. Well said. Icelandic newsroom.